Today, we are surrounded by messages, talking, noise everywhere, online, on television, billboards on the street, at church, everywhere you go. What makes the difference between those who are just talking and those who are being heard? George, it's charisma.
Welcome to Your Intended Message. My guest today is Scott Mason. Here's 3 facts that I think you should know about Scott. 1, he is a graduate of Columbia Law School, and he worked as legal counsel and a senior executive with government and nonprofit organizations for a quarter of a century. 2, Scott's insight on Greek mythology and business success have appeared in book compilations and online magazines and blogs. He additionally was the founding host of the Greater New York City area's official podcast for Toastmasters International. That's the world's largest public speaking organization. And 3, Scott encourages everyone listening, everyone he knows, to find a personal mythological avatar whose characteristics inspire you and keep you reaching high. His is Helios, the god of the sun, and has been ever since he was a little boy. Scott Mason, welcome to Your Intended Message.
George, I am ecstatic to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
Delighted to be talking with you, Scott. And what is it about Helios that appeals to you? And what characteristic would you more like to be of Helios?
I love that you asked that question. Helios represents a number of different things. As you just said during Your Intended Message intro that sounded so great, was the god of the sun. As the god of the sun, certain things were directly related to him. Obviously, the light that he emanated that gave the world the ability to live. Light, enlightenment, radiance passed on to others is part of what my personal mission is. And I profoundly relate to that, number 1. Number 2, evil deeds, hurt, lies, they cannot survive the sunlight. The sunlight is the antidote to emotional and inner darkness. Helios was known as the guardian of oaths because of the sun's ability to disinfect the world of the poison of dishonesty. And so the ethical representation of Helios is a lot of what speaks to me. Finally, note that every day Helios rises, goes to the pinnacle of the firmament, then descends. That represents constant aspiration and resilience. All of those qualities I like to see in myself, but they are also, as you mentioned, George, aspirational, because we never can be perfectly ethical. We never can be perfectly resilient. We can never reach the summit of knowledge, and we certainly can always provide more light and knowledge to the world.
And Scott, I'm intrigued by that, because what I see in that that model of someone or something who you'd like to be more like, or whose qualities you admire, that in those tough times you might say to yourself, well, Scott, how would Helios handle this problem?
Yeah. Absolutely. And, I'd be curious to hear if there are any sort of gods that you're aware of as you've prepared for this that might speak to you similarly. I will say before we get to that, there's a client I have who has been struggling with areas of letting his creativity express, letting his self-discipline manifest. For him, the god Apollo actually spoke and resonated very deeply. And when he's thinking about how he deals with, and he's had health issues. Apollo is the god of light. of reason, of healing, and embedded in all of that is self-discipline and, of course, creativity. And so he literally has slacked me at various times during our coaching and said, I did or didn't do X, Y, Z because Apollo would or wouldn't do it. It's inspiring. But now I've got to hear about you.
Well, there are many figures from Greek mythology that I admire, and I suppose the one that I would pick, who I would prefer, that would be Perseus, because he killed the monsters.
Yes.
And I think we all have monsters to fight in our life. Some of them are self-imagined, and others are the community around us, or the struggles or the tasks that we take on. It might feel like a monster, and no one may understand the monster we're fighting, but Perseus slayed monsters, and he did it, and he slayed impossible monsters, as something that one person shouldn't be able to do.
Actually, I'm going to bust you out a little bit, George. Before we started taping, you and I had a conversation about some apprentices that you're bringing on, and they were from Africa, and you wanted to work with them to help you. I find it interesting in light of that conversation that you mentioned Perseus, because Perseus, from a symbolic perspective, and I actually wrote a series of essays about this for LinkedIn and Instagram, represents also someone who understands the need to ask for help when it comes to achieving their goals. He literally thought originally, he made the promise to kill Medusa basically as a boast. But then the king that he made this boast in front of held him to it. He realized pretty quickly, I can't do this alone. This is more than any one person can handle. And so he sought the help of the gods Athena and Hermes, who literally walked him through an entire process, along with some other folks along on the way, to find Medusa and then to destroy her. On the way back, he stopped in Ethiopia to help some other people out. That was a woman who was being chained to a rock to be eaten by a monster as a sacrifice. He used Medusa's head, or maybe he actually used a sword to kill that monster. But in any event, he left with this woman, Andromeda, who was an Ethiopian princess, flew back to Greece, and they founded actually the greatest ancient Greek civilization of Mycenae. And so I think that in terms of what you just said to me about what you're doing in your own professional life right now as a growing business person, where you want to go, and the possible outcomes of what your work with other people could lead to, Perseus is perhaps an even greater and more profound metaphor than you even realized.
Thank you. That's enlightening to hear. And you're right. I do, as much as I want help from these apprentices, I also appreciate that I'm helping them.
Yeah.
I'm helping them grow as people, not only just their business skills, but as individuals as well. And that is that's tremendously satisfying.
Nothing's more satisfying than when you are self-actualized. I tell everyone that I work with, and I tell this to you too, George, and anyone who's listening, the Greek myths have stayed with us for thousands of years because they resonate. Why do they resonate? Because the characters in them, as well as the stories themselves, but let's talk about the characters right now, speak to fundamental qualities that all of us as human beings either have within or aspire to, as both the examples of Helios and Perseus attest.
And the Greek characters, of course, embody the best of what people wanted to be at the time, but they also had flaws, so that so that humans could relate to the gods because the gods were flawed.
Absolutely. And understanding how the gods use those flaws to ultimately leverage themselves into helping create a world for mortals that either benefited mortals by teaching them lessons punishing them sometimes, or further creation was a foundational element of Greek mythology and a large part of its appeal. However, there is one thing that you didn't, that is kind of embedded off to the side with what you said that I wanted to talk to you about very briefly, which is that most of the characters, like the gods, were aspirational even with the flaws. But let's not forget that the negative characters in Greek mythology were every bit as foundational to the messages, to the intended message that the ancient poets and orators and storytellers shared with people, as were the gods themselves, because they understood, as you're sort of saying, George, that the roles that we play in our lives ultimately dictate outcomes. They had, for instance, 5 general types of negative roles that people could fall into that were dangerous and could keep their intended message and their self-actualization from ever happening.
Scott, and people might be wondering at this point, okay, what does Greek mythology have to do with success in business and communication?
Yes. So let's talk about business itself very briefly, and then we'll dive more deeply into communication. Business itself is as the Greek gods are to the individual. The business owner or the executive, if you're at a high enough level with an organization, are ultimately avatars for the business itself. How we define ourselves, the roles that we play day to day in our work lives, or the myths that we tell ourselves, ultimately then roll out and define what that business becomes. Understanding the different types of myths that can be toxic and what those myths represented for the day-to-day thousands of years ago, as much as they do right now, as well as the significance of the specific allegorical roles that we play in our lives, can put us as avatars for our business on the track to being able to up-level our leadership and transform both the organizations themselves and our futures as leaders of that organization. So that's the answer vis-a-vis business. Let's talk about communication. Charisma, in particular, was an issue that came up again and again and again in Greek mythology. In fact, in some of the most important and best remembered Greek myths of all, charisma is the key. If we cannot communicate with charisma, ain't nobody listening to you. Today, we are surrounded by messages, talking, noise, vivid imagery everywhere, online, on television, billboards on the street, at church, everywhere you go. What makes the difference between those who are just talking and those who are being heard? George, it's charisma.
How do we get this charisma? Is it a pill? Can we read a book about it? Are we born with it or not?
I'm glad you asked that latter question. And I'll circle that and the first question. A, we can get it. B, some of us may be born with more or less of it, but anyone can get it. And by the way, the Greek myths are very specific about that. We can get that into that if you want to or not. But let's make it clear. It can be taught. You can learn it through practice, through sort of stumbling on your own, through working with different groups, through doing a lot of inner work, and then combining that with things like marketing and messaging and speechcraft, as well as general oratorical technique practice or knowledge gaining. Or you can work, obviously, with someone like me that coaches people specifically on charisma, on becoming a charismatic Olympian. Either way, it is possible for anyone to become charismatic. Now, that charisma may not look the same if you're George or if you're Scott Mason. I've had petite older women come up to me and say, well, Scott, you're 6'1", you've got a huge personality and a large voice, and you're dramatic and all. I can't be that. All of that isn't charisma. That's entertaining. Anyone can be charismatic so long as they take the 4 foundational steps and apply them into their lives to become charismatic. And it manifests itself very differently depending on who you are and what age and stage and other characteristics you have in your life.
Scott, you teased us. You got to tell us what those 4 foundational steps are.
Well, hey, you grabbed onto the bait, George. What can I say? And that's part of making sure I get my intended message out, which is why I love this title of your podcast so much.
Now, just before you answer that, I'm curious. That technique you did there to tell us here's 4 steps, and then you didn't go into it. Is that a charisma technique?
Absolutely. It's about messaging. It's about empathizing with the audience and thinking what will keep them interested, just blurting everything out or piquing curiosity a little bit. The reason we finish novels is, and why mystery novels in particular are so popular. You want to know what happens at the end. If Agatha Christie had written down the murderer was XYZ on page 1, she wouldn't have sold a lot of novels. Come on, folks. So let's learn from the masters. Like Helios would do when he is constantly striving higher and higher up into the firmament.
And I can see him whispering into your ear right now. Shine that light, Scott. Shine that light.
That's why I just got a little sunburn in my ear. If he comes your way, you might have to put on some protection too. Did you wear your sunscreen today, George?
No.
Well, we'll get you next time. So the 4 steps. First of all, explore your full charismatic range. Understand the entire range of emotions that you have within you and how those manifest. In business, you see too often one range. Hi, I'm George. I'm the host of your intended message podcast, right? Okay. That's not an entire charismatic range. Number 2, connect your heart with your brain. There's a pipe that connects the two. When that connection is nice and secure, you turn the valve in your voice, charisma begins to emerge. Third, focus on some advanced techniques that really require deep thinking. I call that unleashing the power voice valve, but really what it is a focus on humor, being the ability to be able to face a negative audience with confidence, and then to own your presence wherever you are. Finally, tie all of the actual speaking and communication skills into messaging. And I particularly mention that last point and save it for last because it goes as to something I hinted at a little bit earlier. Charisma and entertainment can be confused, but they're not the same. Being up there and being energetic and ballistic and dramatic and having pauses and stomping around a stage is undoubtedly entertaining, but it gets old after a while and people forget it. If you tie it all to a message, it's like an arrow that goes from Perseus's bow right into the heart of anyone who's listening.
And what I'm hearing there, Scott, is that especially the caution that charisma is not equal to entertainment, because there are entertainers who have charisma. Oprah is entertaining and she has charisma. Yeah. On the other hand, Mother Teresa wasn't entertaining, but she had charisma.
Oh, yes, she did. There was a Greek goddess by the name of Hestia. Hestia was the goddess of the hearth. Hestia was very undramatic, and quiet, which is why there aren't any myths about her and why a lot of people haven't heard about her. Now, there was only room for 12 gods on Olympus, and eventually a new god came into town. His name was Dionysus, the god of wine. And it became pretty apparent that he needed to be an Olympian. But what were they going to do? There were only 12 thrones, and The god of the forge wasn't about to build a 13th. Hestia, when Dionysus came to Olympus, gently stood up on her throne. And she said, Dionysus, softly and quietly, take mine. Then she asked for a simple wood chair with a pillow. She wore the same gray headdress every day. Quietly, she sat down in the center of the Olympian throne room and made that wood chair quietly her throne. Now, I will say this, Hestia received more offerings than any god except Zeus. Under her Roman name, Vesta, Hestia's cult was so popular and so strong that eventually when Rome was Christianized, they had to step in and forcibly outlaw it, unlike most of the other deities. Hestia understood her message. Hestia was quiet. She stuck to who and what she was about and was true to who she was inside. And let me tell you, if you are a deity who is so powerful that the Roman government has to go in and outlaw you, you have charisma. Does that speak to you at all, George? Do you think it might speak to other folks?
I believe so. Yeah, that's a powerful message. That when your presence, your message is so powerful that the people have to outlaw it. that says something. Now, Scott, when we realize that the Greek myths are simply myths, but they're neat stories.
Absolutely.
They're fabulous stories, and there's great analogies there. When you start talking to your clients about the Greek myths, do they say, Scott, business, come down to earth here, Scott, earth to Scott? Do they say something like that to you, and how do you respond?
Your intended message could not be a more appropriate set of words for the answer to that question. When I decided to land upon this framework as the tool for passing on my message, I knew that there would be a lot of people that responded to it exactly as you just described. And in fact, one of the things that I viewed initially as a sign that this ultimately would succeed was the amount of negativity that I received unsolicited online. I had people, by the way, who didn't seem to understand that I realized that Greek myths, right, like Zeus doesn't really exist. So I had people that were concerned about my immortal soul, or people who, reminded me that I wasn't talking about the Bible, that sort of stuff. And I also, though, had people, including some in my immediate circle, who felt the need to send me text messages or DMs saying that what I was doing sucked. Actually, George, that's charisma. Because I'll tell you, how many times when you're scrolling through social media do you feel the need to stop and tell someone that you hate what they're doing? Usually, most people just scroll on. It said to me, it had an impact. My message is not intended to go to everyone. If you don't like Greek myths, well, I can get you to like them. But if you don't like allegory, if you don't like something that's out of the box and creative, and there's nothing wrong with folks that aren't that way, I don't judge them, this ain't for you. The clients I have, make no mistake, they are committed. I have a client who began my program. We start talking about ethics from the beginning because ethics do relate to charisma in a less direct way. He started reading Aristotelian ethics just on his free time because of that. That's commitment. I have other clients who, when we do the actual mission statement that we center their charismatic exercises around, found an obscure Greek goddess that really spoke to her, and that helped her frame her message and tighten and understand exactly who and what she needs to be. This program is not for those who are just interested in what I call pep rally motivation, or you go girl sort of encouragement of what you need. This is for those who are seriously seeking transformation. As cerebral, albeit fun, as the Greek myths are, That's the depth that I seek for my clients to go to. The deeper you dig, George, the more you find.
True. The deeper you dig, the more you find. No question. On any topic, on any discussion, and there are many times that I've had conversations here through the podcast where a topic comes up, and I think, gee, I'd like to go deeper on that. Scott, the folks who work with you, do they typically, those who like you, those who like the concept, and I suppose actually there's a lesson there when it comes to charisma and marketing and business in general. First of all, not everyone's going to like us and our ideas, and
Yes.
they're not our customers. They're not who we
Exactly.
want to work with.
Totally.
But those who like the idea, the concept, they must be a delight to work with because we can have, and I enjoy the myths so much, and it's funny. I remember going to a different religion, the Hindu religion, if I recall right. I believe there's three. There's one God, but there's three versions of the God,
Right.
And I remember, and one was the creator, one was the destroyer, and one was the nurturer. I believe those were the titles. And I had a conversation with one of the companies I was working with. The people came in from the corporate office, so we were a far away office, and they came in and so over dinner we were talking about things, and they're saying, well, tell us about you, George. And I said, well, in the Hindu religion there's these three characters, and I've always identified as the creator. Mm-hmm. And the funny thing is, obviously that conversation was taken out of context, because later it came back to me that what they were saying is that George thinks he's a god.
Well, you know what? I just have to interject here. They may interpret that as they see fit, but I tell you, my friend, as I tell all of my clients, I want them to be gods. I want them to self-identify as Olympians. Now, it's interesting. Earlier, you mentioned Perseus as an avatar for yourself. Perseus, going back to something we mentioned a few minutes ago, didn't become great by just going to an anthill and smashing it. He went all the way and killed this monster Medusa that had been terrorizing the world since the beginning of time. So you yourself, by picking that allegory, in a way have proven the point about digging deep and making sure that if you want to accomplish anything of consequence, moving beyond the superficial really matters, or moving beyond the easy. But be that as it may, let's talk about heroism itself. In Greek mythology, it's important to understand the hero status was a temporary one. You began in one place and you traveled to an ending. Now, in the Greek religion, when you died, you went to this realm called Hades, their underworld, and you drank out of a river and you forgot your memories. You ended up just sort of wafting around like this zombie that didn't have an identity or didn't have a memory of who you are. Unless you had chosen to be a hero. In that case, you were given a special dispensation. You went to the Isles of the Blessed, and there you got to retain your memories and your identity. George, you even got to travel back and forth to Earth, where people built these mounds that were covering your tomb and literally worshiped you as a god. The Olympians were fully self-actualized. As you mentioned earlier, George, they weren't perfect, but they were completely who and what they were in the universe and transforming it around them. And not only that, from a business perspective, they demanded their due. If you didn't sacrifice appropriately to the Olympians, in other words, if you didn't give them the revenue or the pay that they deserved, you didn't receive the benefit of their services. If you were viewing yourself as a god, I applaud you, my brother. Keep doing it. And walk back to that company and you tell them Scott Mason said that, okay?
Oh, I'd so like to do that now, Scott. At the time, I just didn't know how to do it. Now, Scott, I heard earlier when talking about charisma, and this might be a misconception that a lot of people have, but I got the impression that what you're saying is charisma attracts those who you want to attract, but it also repels.
It can, very much so. Yes. Let's think about two of the most charismatic people of the 20th century. One, Martin Luther King. He attracted a lot of people, but hey, he had one, he was assassinated. There were a lot of people that hated him. So what? Number two, Hitler. A lot of people hated him, rightly so. He unfortunately had charisma and attracted enough people to destroy an entire continent and cost millions upon millions of lives. That's the power of charisma. Now, I mentioned earlier, my aspirational deity is Helios, the guardian of oaths. And I also mentioned that ethics is part of what I work with my clients on, mostly from day one. That's because the messaging and the purpose that they're using their charisma for really should be something that's ethical and true to who and what they are, and is in consideration of the betterment of the world. Obviously, if someone were to come to me and say, I want to become more charismatic so I could murder people, you're going somewhere else. You ain't an Olympian. You're one of those monsters. And whatever it is that's causing you to be that way probably could use a little bit of slaying. Maybe you could even be reborn into a hero. But I do want to make that important point. Attraction and repulsion come with having any message that resonates more deeply than just on the surface.
Scott, before we do wrap up, I want to mention that for listeners and viewers who'd like to know more about you and perhaps have an assessment with you, a charisma assessment, they're open to that, and that's no charge, no obligation assessment, and we have that link in the description below. So for a one-on-one assessment, complimentary charisma assessment with Scott, then click the link below and book your time with him. Scott, in preparing to wrap up, if you could sit down with a business leader or aspiring business leader, and you could give them, and they ask the question, say, well, Scott, I'm building my career. How do I enhance my charisma? What 1, 2, or 3 tips might you give them?
It can be very easy to focus on the weaknesses that you have as a speaker. And of course, if there are habits that are so distracting that they are going to get in the way of any message that you have, I would work with a client and make a suggestion to such a person that those be something that they consider looking at. But really, I urge them to uncover what I call charismatic gemstones, the unique qualities that they have that are the basis of building a singular powerhouse voice and presence upon. Now, my voice is loud. I'm not hesitant to dominate my space and a room that I am in. I won't lie. A lot of people don't like that. But understanding that that's who I was, that was a charismatic gemstone, as you can imagine, as I've worked to develop my own charisma, which I didn't always have, I've leaned into it, just as Hestia leaned into her own quietness and focus as to her place. So find your charismatic gemstone. Don't hesitate to build on them. Change your life.
Fabulous advice. Great advice. My guest today is Scott Mason, reminding you that there's a need to ask for help. If you like what you heard, remember to like, comment, and share this podcast. Come back every week for more practical insights to help you convey your intended message. I'm your host, George Torok.